The morning sun blazed mercilessly over Fort Carson, Colorado, casting long shadows across the training grounds where soldiers gathered for their weekly physical training assessment. The temperature was already climbing toward 90 degrees at 7 in the morning, promising another scorching day in what had become the hottest summer on record for the region. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez stood in formation with her unit, her military uniform crisp and perfectly pressed despite the early hour. At 28, she had served her country for 8 years with distinction, earning commendations for her work in communications and her dedication to training newer recruits. Her personnel file was spotless, her performance reviews consistently excellent, and her peers respected her quiet competence and unwavering reliability. But, today, as she stood among her fellow soldiers, Maria felt the familiar weight of anxiety settling in her chest like a stone. Physical training days had become increasingly difficult for her over the past 18 months, though she had managed to hide her struggles from most of her colleagues and superiors. The army jacket she wore, regulation and identical to everyone else's, concealed something that would have shocked her commanding officers and forever changed their perception of her dedication to duty. Colonel James Mitchell approached the formation with his characteristic military bearing, his boots striking the asphalt in perfect rhythm. At 52, he was a career soldier who had earned his rank through decades of exemplary service, including tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. He commanded respect through a combination of tactical brilliance, unwavering standards, and a reputation for accepting nothing less than excellence from his troops. His philosophy was simple: the military had no place for weakness, excuses, or special treatment. Every soldier under his command was expected to meet the same high standards, regardless of their personal circumstances. The colonel's steel-gray eyes swept across the assembled soldiers as he prepared to address them. He took pride in maintaining a unit where every member could be counted on in combat situations, where physical fitness was not just encouraged but demanded, and where mental toughness was forged through consistent challenges and high expectations. In his view, the strength of the military lay in its uniform standards and the understanding that every soldier was capable of extraordinary performance when pushed to their limits. Maria noticed the colonel's gaze lingering on her section of the formation, though she couldn't determine whether this was routine inspection or something more focused. She maintained her military bearing, shoulders back and eyes forward, even as her heart rate increased with nervous anticipation. The physical training assessment would include push-ups, sit-ups, and a 2-mile run, all of which had become significantly more challenging for her recently due to circumstances beyond her control. The training sergeant began calling out instructions, his voice carrying clearly across the assembly area. Soldiers began arranging themselves into testing groups, the familiar routine of military assessment beginning to unfold. Maria moved with her assigned group toward the designated testing area, her movements precise and professional despite the growing tension she felt building inside her chest. As the first group began their push-up assessment, Maria found herself studying the faces of her fellow soldiers. These were men and women she had served alongside for years, people who had become like family to her in the way that only military units could. They trusted each other with their lives, depended on one another in ways that civilians could never fully understand, and maintained bonds forged through shared hardship and common purpose. Staff Sergeant Johnson, a veteran of 3 deployments, was executing perfect push-ups with mechanical precision. Private Martinez, fresh out of basic training, struggled slightly but pushed through with determination that reminded Maria of her own early days in the service. Sergeant Williams, a single mother who had somehow managed to excel in every aspect of military life while raising 2 children, moved through her exercises with the efficiency that had made her one of the unit's most respected members. These people were more than colleagues to Maria, they were her military family. The thought of disappointing them, of being seen as weak or incapable, was almost unbearable. She had worked too hard and come too far to allow anything to compromise her standing in their eyes or her ability to serve effectively alongside them. The morning progressed with its usual rhythm of military efficiency. Groups rotated through different stations, scores were recorded, and the assessment continued with the methodical precision that characterized all military operations. Maria's group was scheduled for the final rotation, giving her additional time to prepare mentally for what she knew would be a challenging test of her ability to maintain her carefully constructed facade. Colonel Mitchell moved among the groups, observing performances and occasionally offering words of encouragement or correction. His presence added an additional layer of pressure to the already demanding assessment, as soldiers naturally wanted to perform their best when under the direct observation of their commanding officer. His reputation for noticing even the smallest details meant that any substandard performance was likely to be noted and remembered. As her group's turn approached, Maria felt her anxiety increasing exponentially. She had managed to complete previous assessments through sheer determination and careful preparation, but each one had become more difficult than the last. The physical demands of military service, combined with her hidden condition, created a perfect storm of challenges that she had somehow managed to navigate through willpower and strategic planning. The testing sergeant called for her group to take their positions for the push-up assessment. Maria assumed the starting position, her hands planted firmly on the ground, her body aligned in the perfect military form she had practiced thousands of times throughout her career. Around her, her fellow soldiers prepared for their own assessments, focused and determined to meet or exceed the required standards. Colonel Mitchell positioned himself where he could observe the entire group, his experienced eye ready to evaluate each soldier's performance. His standards were well known throughout the unit: form must be perfect, count must be accurate, and any deviation from the established protocols would result in a failed assessment and the need for remediation training. The sergeant began the assessment, calling out the rhythm that would guide the soldiers through their push-ups. Maria began the familiar movement, her muscles engaging in the coordinated effort required for proper execution. For the first several repetitions, everything proceeded normally, her form maintaining the high standards she had always demonstrated. But, as the assessment continued, Maria began to feel the familiar strain that had become increasingly problematic in recent months. Her breathing became more labored, her movements less fluid, and a subtle tremor began to affect her arms as they supported her body weight. She fought to maintain her composure, drawing on every reserve of mental strength she possessed to continue the assessment without revealing her growing distress. Colonel Mitchell noticed the slight change in her performance almost immediately. His trained eye caught the subtle variations in her form, the slight hesitation in her movements, and the obvious increase in effort required for what should have been a routine exercise for a soldier of her experience and fitness level. His expression shifted to one of concern mixed with disappointment as he observed what appeared to be a significant decline in her physical capabilities. When the push-up assessment concluded, Maria had managed to complete the minimum required repetitions, but barely. Her performance was markedly lower than her previous assessments, and the obvious strain she had experienced was impossible to hide completely. She rose to her feet, attempting to maintain her military bearing despite the physical and emotional toll the exercise had taken on her. The sit-up assessment followed, with similar results. Maria completed the required repetitions through sheer determination, but her struggle was increasingly obvious to both the testing sergeant and Colonel Mitchell. Her face showed signs of distress that went beyond the normal exertion expected during physical training, and her breathing remained labored even during the brief rest periods between assessments. As the group prepared for the final component of the assessment, the 2-mile run, Colonel Mitchell made a decision that would set in motion the events that would forever change his understanding of military service and personal sacrifice. He approached Maria directly, his expression stern and his voice carrying the authority of his rank and position. The other soldiers in the group continued their preparations for the run, but several couldn't help but notice their commanding officer's focused attention on their colleague. The tension in the air was palpable as everyone sensed that something significant was about to unfold, though none could have predicted the profound impact the next few minutes would have on all of them. Maria stood at attention as her colonel approached, her mind racing through possible explanations for her declining performance that wouldn't reveal the truth she had worked so hard to keep hidden. She had always prided herself on her ability to meet every challenge the military had presented, and the thought of being seen as someone who made excuses or sought special treatment was deeply troubling to her sense of professional identity. The moment of confrontation was about to begin, setting the stage for a revelation that would challenge every assumption about strength, dedication, and the true cost of military service. Neither Maria nor Colonel Mitchell fully understood how the next few minutes would transform their relationship and influence the culture of their entire unit for years to come. Colonel Mitchell stopped directly in front of Maria, his posture rigid and his expression reflecting the no-nonsense approach that had defined his military career. The other soldiers in the formation continued their preparations for the running assessment, but the tension radiating from their commanding officer's focused attention was impossible to ignore. Several cast sideways glances in their direction, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," the colonel began, his voice carrying across the training ground with the authority that came from decades of command experience. "I've been observing your performance this morning, and, frankly, I'm concerned about what I'm seeing." Maria maintained her position of attention, her eyes fixed straight ahead as military protocol demanded. Inside, her heart was racing, not just from the physical exertion of the assessments she had just completed, but from the growing realization that her carefully maintained facade was beginning to crumble under the scrutiny of her commanding officer. "Your push-up count was barely acceptable, your sit-up showed significant strain, and, from what I observed, you're already showing signs of fatigue before we've even begun the running assessment," Colonel Mitchell continued, his voice growing more stern with each word. "This level of performance is well below the standards I expect from my non-commissioned officers, and, frankly, it's unacceptable for someone in your position." The colonel began to pace in front of Maria, his boots striking the asphalt with measured precision. His years of experience had taught him to recognize the signs of soldiers who were either unprepared for their duties or attempting to find ways to avoid the rigorous demands of military service. In his mind, Maria's declining performance could only be attributed to a lack of preparation, decreased dedication, or an attempt to find an easy way out of her responsibilities. "I've seen this before, Staff Sergeant," he said, his tone taking on a lecturing quality that made several nearby soldiers uncomfortable. "Soldiers who start looking for excuses, who begin to slack off in their physical preparation, who think that their rank or their time in service gives them the right to coast through their assessments." Maria felt each word like a physical blow to her sense of professional pride and personal integrity. Throughout her 8 years of military service, she had never been accused of being lazy, unprepared, or seeking special treatment. Her personnel file was filled with commendations, her peers respected her work ethic, and her dedication to the military had never been questioned until this moment. "Sir, I can complete the running assessment," Maria responded, her voice steady despite the emotional turmoil she was experiencing. She knew that explaining her situation would require revealing information she had worked desperately to keep private, information that could potentially end her military career or result in a medical discharge that would strip away everything she had worked to achieve. Colonel Mitchell stopped his pacing and faced her directly, his expression reflecting both disappointment and growing irritation. "Staff Sergeant, I don't want to hear about what you can or can't complete. What I want to see is the level of performance that justifies the rank you wear and the responsibility you've been given. Your soldiers look up to you, and this kind of substandard performance sets a terrible example for the entire unit." The weight of his words settled over the training ground like a heavy blanket, creating an uncomfortable silence that was broken only by the distant sounds of other military units conducting their own training exercises. The soldiers in Maria's group had stopped their preparations entirely, unable to continue with their routine while witnessing their colleagues' public reprimand by their commanding officer. "I've been in the military for over 30 years, Colonel Mitchell continued, his voice rising slightly as his frustration became more apparent. "I've served in combat zones, I've led soldiers through some of the most challenging conditions imaginable, and I've never tolerated excuses or substandard performance from my people. The military doesn't have room for soldiers who can't meet basic fitness standards, regardless of their personal circumstances or whatever excuses they might want to offer." Maria's fellow soldiers watched the confrontation with growing discomfort, many of them recognizing that they were witnessing something that went beyond a routine performance evaluation. Staff Sergeant Johnson, who had served alongside Maria for 4 years, knew her to be one of the most dedicated and reliable soldiers in the unit. Private Martinez, despite his limited experience, had already learned to respect Maria's professionalism and work ethic during his initial training. Sergeant Williams, the single mother who had overcome her own share of challenges during her military career, found herself particularly troubled by the public nature of the confrontation. She had noticed subtle changes in Maria's performance over the past several months, but had attributed them to the normal stress and fatigue that affected all soldiers during demanding periods of training and operations. "Sir," Maria began again, her voice betraying the first hints of the strain she was under. "I understand your concerns, and I take full responsibility for my performance today. However, I would like to request the opportunity to complete the running assessment and demonstrate my commitment to meeting the standards expected of me." Colonel Mitchell's expression hardened further at what he perceived as another attempt to deflect responsibility and avoid accountability for poor performance. His experience had taught him that soldiers who couldn't meet basic fitness standards were often looking for ways to explain away their failures rather than taking the necessary steps to improve their condition and preparation. "Request denied, Staff Sergeant," he said firmly. "I'm not going to waste the unit's time watching you struggle through an assessment you're clearly not prepared to complete successfully. Instead, I want you to explain to me and to your fellow soldiers exactly why you think your performance this morning has been acceptable." The challenge hung in the air between them, creating a moment of tension that seemed to stretch endlessly despite lasting only a few seconds. Maria found herself at a crossroads that she had been trying desperately to avoid for months. She could continue to attempt to hide her situation and risk further damage to her reputation and standing in the unit, or she could reveal the truth that she had kept carefully concealed from her colleagues and superiors. Furthermore, Colonel Mitchell continued, clearly building toward what he intended to be a decisive conclusion to the confrontation, "I'm beginning to question whether you're truly committed to maintaining the standards required for military service. Perhaps you become too comfortable in your position, too confident that your previous performance will carry you through situations where you're clearly unprepared." The accusation of becoming comfortable or complacent struck Maria particularly hard because it was so far from the truth of her situation. She had been fighting every day just to maintain her ability to serve, working harder than ever to compensate for challenges that her commanding officer couldn't see and wouldn't understand without a full explanation of her circumstances. "I'm going to be very clear about this, Staff Sergeant," the colonel said, his voice taking on the tone of finality that indicated he was preparing to make a decision that would have lasting consequences for Maria's military career. "If you can't provide me with a satisfactory explanation for this morning's performance, I'm going to have serious concerns about your continued ability to serve effectively in your current position." The threat was unmistakable, and Maria realized that she had reached the moment she had been dreading for months. Her options had narrowed to a single choice: reveal the truth that she had been hiding, or accept the consequences of allowing her commanding officer to believe that she had simply given up on maintaining the standards that had defined her military career. She looked briefly at her fellow soldiers, seeing in their faces a mixture of confusion, concern, and support. These were people who had served alongside her through challenging deployments and demanding training exercises, people who knew her character and her dedication even if they couldn't understand what was happening to her performance during these assessments. Staff Sergeant Johnson gave her an almost imperceptible nod, a small gesture of encouragement that reminded her that she had allies among her colleagues regardless of what Colonel Mitchell might think about her current situation. Private Martinez looked confused but supportive, while Sergeant Williams wore an expression of growing concern that suggested she suspected there might be more to the situation than was immediately apparent. The moment had arrived for Maria to make a decision that would either end her military career in disgrace or force her to reveal a truth that she had never intended to share with anyone in her professional life. The weight of 8 years of dedicated service, the respect of her peers, and her own sense of integrity as a soldier all hung in the balance as she prepared to respond to her commanding officer's ultimatum. Colonel Mitchell stood waiting for her response, his expression making it clear that he expected either a satisfactory explanation or an admission that she had simply failed to prepare adequately for her duties. He had no way of knowing that the next few minutes would fundamentally change his understanding of military service, personal sacrifice, and the incredible strength required to serve one's country while facing challenges that most people would find insurmountable. The confrontation had reached its critical moment, setting the stage for a revelation that would affect not just Maria and her commanding officer, but every soldier who witnessed what was about to unfold on that hot morning at Fort Carson. Maria stood in the scorching morning heat, feeling the weight of her colonel's ultimatum pressing down on her like the oppressive desert sun above. The training ground had fallen into an unnatural quiet, with even the distant sounds of other military exercises seeming muted as everyone waited for her response to Colonel Mitchell's challenge. She had spent countless nights over the past 18 months lying awake, wondering if this moment would ever come. She had developed elaborate strategies to hide her condition, carefully planned her training schedules around her medical appointments, and pushed herself to physical limits that would have been unimaginable to most people. All of this effort had been focused on one goal: continuing to serve her country with honor while protecting the privacy of a situation that she feared would end her military career. "Sir," Maria began, her voice steady despite the emotional storm raging inside her chest. You're right that my performance today has not met the standards you expect, and you deserve an explanation. Colonel Mitchell's expression remained stern, though something in Maria's tone suggested that this conversation was about to take a direction he hadn't anticipated. The other soldiers in the formation shifted uncomfortably, sensing that they were about to witness something significant but unsure of what was unfolding before them. Maria reached for the zipper of her military jacket with movements that were deliberate and measured. Before I provide that explanation, sir, I need to show you something that I've been keeping private for personal and professional reasons. The colonel's eyebrows furrowed slightly as he watched her begin to remove her jacket. Military regulations governed when and how uniform items could be removed during official duties, and he was prepared to address any breach of protocol. However, something in Maria's demeanor suggested that this was not a casual violation of military dress code. I've been serving in this unit for 4 years, Maria continued as she carefully removed her jacket, and, before that, I served for 4 years in other assignments. Throughout that time, I've tried to meet every challenge, complete every mission, and exceed every standard placed before me. As the jacket came off, Maria's military shirt became visible underneath. What Colonel Mitchell saw caused his stern expression to shift dramatically, replaced by a look of complete shock and disbelief. The other soldiers who could see what was happening gasped audibly, their own assumptions about their colleague's situation completely overturned in an instant. Maria's left arm was missing from just above the elbow, the sleeve of her shirt carefully pinned and folded to conceal the absence of her limb. The prosthetic arm and hand that she had been wearing inside her jacket had enabled her to complete her duties and assessments with an appearance of normalcy that had fooled everyone around her for months. The silence on the training ground became absolute as the full implications of what they were seeing settled over the assembled soldiers. This was not a case of poor preparation or declining dedication. This was a soldier who had been overcoming extraordinary physical challenges while maintaining the pretense of normal capability, pushing herself far beyond what anyone should have expected while hiding a disability that would have qualified her for immediate medical discharge from military service. Colonel Mitchell stood frozen, his military bearing temporarily abandoned as he processed the reality of what Maria had just revealed. His 30 years of military experience had never prepared him for a situation quite like this one, where his fundamental assumptions about a soldier's capabilities and motivations had been so completely and dramatically overturned. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, he began, his voice noticeably softer than it had been moments earlier. When did this happen? How long have you been serving with this condition? Maria straightened her shoulders, maintaining her military posture even though the secret she had guarded so carefully was now exposed to her entire unit. 18 months ago, sir, during a training accident at my previous assignment. I lost my arm in an equipment malfunction during a routine maintenance exercise. The colonel's mind raced as he calculated the timeline she had just provided. 18 months of active duty service while dealing with the loss of a limb, learning to use a prosthetic, and somehow maintaining her performance standards well enough that he had never suspected anything was wrong until this morning's assessment. The Army Medical Board recommended me for medical discharge, Maria continued, her voice gaining strength as she finally spoke the truth she had been hiding. But I appealed the decision because I believed I could continue to serve effectively. I've been working with physical therapists, occupational specialists, and my own medical team to maintain my capabilities and continue performing my duties. Staff Sergeant Johnson, who had served alongside Maria through numerous training exercises and deployments, felt a profound shift in his understanding of his colleague's recent behavior. Small things that he had noticed but never questioned suddenly made perfect sense: her preference for certain equipment configurations, her occasional need to adjust her grip during technical tasks, and the subtle changes in her approach to physical activities. Private Martinez, despite his limited military experience, understood immediately the extraordinary dedication required for what Maria had been accomplishing. His own struggles to meet basic military standards seemed insignificant compared to what his sergeant had been achieving while overcoming challenges he couldn't have imagined. Sergeant Williams felt a surge of respect and admiration for Maria that went beyond anything she had experienced in her own military career. As someone who had faced her own unique challenges as a single mother in the military, she understood the strength required to exceed expectations while dealing with circumstances that most people would find overwhelming. Colonel Mitchell's expression had transformed completely from stern disappointment to something approaching awe. Staff Sergeant, why didn't you inform me of your situation? Why didn't you request appropriate accommodations or modifications to your duties? Maria's response revealed the depth of her commitment to military service and her understanding of the culture in which she served. Sir, with respect, I didn't want special treatment or accommodations. I wanted to prove that I could continue to meet the same standards as any other soldier in the unit. I was afraid that if my condition became known, I would be seen as a liability or given limited responsibilities that didn't match my capabilities. The colonel realized that his assumptions about military fitness and soldier capabilities had been fundamentally challenged by what he was witnessing. This soldier had been outperforming many of her colleagues while dealing with challenges that would have defeated most people before they even attempted to continue their military careers. The prosthetic allows me to perform most of my duties without any problems, Maria explained, gesturing toward the sophisticated device that had enabled her deception for so many months. However, extended physical training, especially in heat like today's, causes problems with the fit and function that make these assessments particularly challenging. Colonel Mitchell began to understand the full scope of what had been happening during the morning's assessment. Maria hadn't been unprepared or uncommitted, she had been dealing with equipment limitations and physical challenges that would have been impossible for him to detect without understanding her situation. The push-ups and sit-ups are difficult because the prosthetic doesn't provide the same stability and control as a natural arm, she continued. And, by the time we reached the running portion, the heat and perspiration would have made the fit problematic enough that I was concerned about equipment failure during the assessment. The revelation transformed everyone's understanding of what they had witnessed during the morning's training. What had appeared to be declining fitness and poor preparation was actually an extraordinary demonstration of determination and adaptation that exceeded anything they had previously seen from any soldier in their unit. Colonel Mitchell's military training kicked in as he processed the tactical and administrative implications of Maria's situation. Staff Sergeant, what documentation do you have regarding your medical status and your authorization to continue active duty? Maria produced a carefully maintained folder from her gear, containing medical evaluations, appeals documentation, and official authorization for her continued service with certain specified limitations. The paperwork revealed a complex process of medical review, psychological evaluation, and administrative appeals that had ultimately resulted in her being cleared for continued military service with appropriate accommodations. The colonel reviewed the documents with growing amazement at the thoroughness of Maria's preparation and the official recognition of her capabilities despite her disability. The military medical system had evaluated her situation comprehensively and determined that she could continue to serve effectively, though with some modifications to standard assessment procedures. Sir, Maria said as he finished reviewing her documentation, I understand if my performance today raises questions about my continued effectiveness. However, I hope you can see that my commitment to this unit and to military service has never wavered, even when facing challenges that most people would consider insurmountable. The training ground remained silent as Colonel Mitchell absorbed the full implications of what he had learned. This was no longer a simple case of a soldier failing to meet standards, this was a profound lesson in dedication, adaptation, and the true meaning of military service that would influence his leadership philosophy for the rest of his career. The moment had arrived for him to respond to Maria's revelation, and his decision would affect not only her future but also set the tone for how his entire unit would understand and appreciate the diverse forms that military excellence could take. Colonel Mitchell stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, his military training warring with the profound emotional impact of Maria's revelation. The documentation in his hands provided official validation of everything she had told him, but the human reality of what he was witnessing transcended any administrative procedure or medical evaluation. The silence on the training ground was broken only by the distant sounds of other military units conducting their exercises, a reminder that life continued around them while this extraordinary moment unfolded. The other soldiers in the formation remained at attention, but their posture reflected the same stunned amazement that their commanding officer was experiencing. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Colonel Mitchell began, his voice carrying a tone of respect that had been completely absent from his earlier confrontation. I owe you an apology that goes far beyond anything I can express in this moment. He carefully returned her medical documentation, his movements reflecting a new understanding of the person standing before him. In 30 years of military service, I have never encountered a demonstration of dedication and commitment that approaches what you have been achieving while serving in my unit. Maria maintained her military bearing, though the relief of finally sharing her secret was visible in the slight relaxation of her shoulders and the way her breathing became more natural. The weight of 18 months of careful deception and constant vigilance had been lifted from her, replaced by the uncertainty of how her revelation would affect her future in the military. "Sir, I want to emphasize that I never intended to deceive you or anyone else in the unit," Maria responded. "My goal was simply to continue serving effectively while dealing with my changed circumstances. I believed that if I could meet the standards and complete my duties successfully, the specific methods I used to achieve those results were less important than the outcomes." Colonel Mitchell nodded slowly as he processed her explanation. "Staff Sergeant, what you've accomplished goes far beyond meeting standards or completing duties. You've redefined what those concepts mean in ways that I'm only beginning to understand." He turned to address the other soldiers who had witnessed the confrontation and revelation. "What we've seen here today is a lesson in military values that I want every one of you to remember for the rest of your careers. This soldier has demonstrated courage, commitment, and adaptability that exceed anything I've previously encountered." Staff Sergeant Johnson stepped forward slightly, his respect for Maria evident in his expression. "Sir, if I may, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez has been one of the most reliable and effective soldiers I've ever served with. Knowing what she's been dealing with makes her performance even more impressive than it already was." Private Martinez, despite his junior rank and limited experience, found the courage to speak. "Sergeant Rodriguez has been one of my best mentors since I joined the unit. She's always been patient with my questions and helpful with my training, even when she was dealing with challenges I never knew about." Sergeant Williams added her own perspective, her voice reflecting the deep respect that comes from understanding personal struggle. "Sir, as someone who has faced my own challenges in military service, I can appreciate the extraordinary strength required for what Staff Sergeant Rodriguez has been accomplishing. She's been an inspiration to all of us, even when we didn't understand the full scope of what she was overcoming." Colonel Mitchell found himself reassessing not just Maria's situation, but his entire approach to leadership and soldier evaluation. The assumptions he had made about physical fitness, standard procedures, and military effectiveness were being challenged by the reality of what exceptional soldiers could accomplish when given appropriate support and understanding. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," he said, returning his attention to Maria, "I want to understand how we can better support your continued service and ensure that your unique situation is properly accommodated without compromising either your effectiveness or the unit's mission." Maria's response revealed the depth of thought she had put into balancing her personal situation with her professional responsibilities. "Sir, most of my duties can be performed without any special considerations. The primary challenges arise during specific physical assessments and certain types of equipment operations that require bilateral manual coordination." The colonel's mind was already working through the administrative and practical implications of supporting Maria's continued service effectively. "What modifications to standard assessment procedures would allow you to demonstrate your physical capabilities accurately while accounting for your prosthetic limitations?" Maria produced another folder from her gear, this one containing research she had conducted on adaptive assessment methods and alternative evaluation criteria that had been developed for soldiers with similar conditions. Her preparation revealed the same thoroughness and attention to detail that had characterized her entire military career. "There are established protocols for modified physical assessments that focus on functional capability rather than standard form requirements," she explained. "These assessments can provide accurate measurements of fitness and capability while accounting for prosthetic limitations and adaptive techniques." Colonel Mitchell reviewed the alternative assessment protocols with growing appreciation for the comprehensive nature of Maria's preparation. The military had developed sophisticated methods for evaluating soldiers with various physical adaptations, recognizing that capability and fitness could be accurately measured using different techniques when traditional methods were not appropriate. Additionally, Maria continued, "There are certain specialized roles and responsibilities where my particular combination of technical skills and adaptive capabilities could provide unique value to the unit's mission." The colonel realized that he had been viewing Maria's situation as a limitation to be accommodated rather than recognizing the potential advantages that her unique perspective and problem-solving capabilities could bring to their operations. Her experience in adapting to physical challenges had likely enhanced her analytical thinking and creative approach to technical problems. Staff Sergeant, I want you to work with our unit's medical liaison and administrative personnel to ensure that all appropriate accommodations are formally documented and implemented, Colonel Mitchell instructed. Furthermore, I want you to develop a training program that can help other soldiers understand adaptive techniques and inclusive leadership principles. Maria's surprise at this unexpected opportunity was evident in her expression. Rather than being seen as someone who needed special treatment or limited responsibilities, she was being asked to take on additional duties that recognized her expertise in areas that most soldiers never had to consider. "Sir, I would be honored to contribute to such a training program," she responded. "There are aspects of adaptive leadership and inclusive team dynamics that could benefit the entire unit, regardless of individual physical capabilities." Colonel Mitchell's transformation from stern disciplinarian to supportive leader was complete, but it represented more than just a change in his attitude toward one soldier. The revelation of Maria's situation had fundamentally altered his understanding of military excellence and the diverse forms that exceptional service could take. "I also want to ensure that you receive appropriate recognition for your exceptional service," he continued. "What you've accomplished while dealing with your changed circumstances represents the highest traditions of military service and deserves formal acknowledgement." The other soldiers in the formation began to understand that they were witnessing more than just a resolution to a disciplinary situation. They were seeing their commanding officer demonstrate the kind of adaptive leadership and inclusive thinking that would make their entire unit stronger and more effective. Furthermore, Colonel Mitchell added, "I want to review our standard assessment procedures and training protocols to ensure that we're effectively identifying and supporting soldiers who might be dealing with challenges that aren't immediately apparent to their supervisors." Maria realized that her decision to reveal her situation had created an opportunity to influence positive change, that while sometimes the greatest strength comes wrapped in what others see as weakness. Sometimes courage wears the disguise of vulnerability, and sometimes the most powerful warriors are the ones who fight battles no one else can see. In a world where military precision and physical excellence are everything, where weakness is not tolerated and excuses are met with contempt, one young woman was about to teach a decorated colonel the most important lesson of his career. She didn't plan to become a symbol of resilience. She didn't seek to challenge the system or prove a point. All she wanted was to serve her country with honor, despite carrying a burden that would have broken most people before they even tried. This is the story of Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, whose quiet determination and hidden struggle would forever change how an entire military base viewed strength, sacrifice, and the true meaning of service above self. It's a story about the assumptions we make, the judgments we pass, and the incredible power of the human spirit to overcome not just physical limitations, but the limitations others place on us. What happened that Tuesday morning in the desert heat of Fort Carson would ripple through the ranks, challenge decades of military thinking, and prove that sometimes the most extraordinary courage comes from the most ordinary moments of truth.